Good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Tom Schleter with today's Tom's Take. Sometimes I'm really amazed, maybe even confused by the ways of God. It's interesting what sometimes He asks us to do when we would think that that would be the last thing that we would do. Today, I hope that all of you will do this. You must again listen to Dutch Sheets on his Give 'em 15 as he shares a dream and a word that his brother Tim gave about being anointed for battle. In that dream, Tim is taken back to be with the army and the warriors and the war council at the time when Joshua and the people were about ready to cross over the Jordan River into the promised land. But sometimes it's amazing when God does something in the midst of what we think would not be the most appropriate time to do it. If we finish that story, we realize that as soon as they crossed over and arrived at Gilgal and started making their preparations for the victories that were going to be a part of their upcoming campaign of occupying God's promised land for them, he says, now it is time for all the men who out in the wilderness, who had journeyed those 40 years, must now be circumcised. And so that is accomplished. And for 3 days in the healing process, they are there in the area around Gilgal, in the plains of Jericho, in a very compromised position, let's put it that way. But yet that was God's command to be prepared for them to be used as an instrument for God in that time. He does anoint us for battle. He anoints us for the time of tribulation and warfare that we are going to be going through, and for, yes, the occupation of the promise, the bringing forth of the fullness of what God has promised us is ours, and in us, and in our case, victory. Victory and the salvation of our nation. But how odd it is. Last evening, we entered into Sukkot. Let me just read a portion of Leviticus 23, which speaks on this, starting with verse 39. On exactly the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the crops of the land, so it speaks about harvest time, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord for 7 days, with a rest on the first day and a rest on the 8th day. Now on the first day you shall take for yourselves foliage of beautiful trees, palm branches, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord for 7 days. You shall thus celebrate it as a feast of the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. In other words, they were to set up booths. It comes up later in that chapter. They were to establish booths. They were supposed to make these habitations. And it was a time of rejoicing. It was a time of great joy and celebration. And it was a joy regarding two different things. Number one, it was a reminder of how God had dwelt with them as they journeyed through the wilderness. And it was also a time of joy for the ingathering of the harvest. It was a time when God said, I am tabernacling in your midst, and I want you to tabernacle in my midst, to remember how I carried you through those years in the wilderness, how your footwear never wore out, your clothes didn't wear out. I took care of you. The healing that was present with you for those 40 years was remarkable. So remember that and rejoice in it. Interestingly, though, we are in Sukkot, and at this very time, they are celebrating it in Israel in the midst of war. In the midst of war against Iran and all of its proxies, including Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. As missiles are firing over them, as the Iron Dome is taking them out, and some are coming through and hitting, as they continue to grieve over what took place a little over a year ago on October 7th. Today and this week is a day of rejoicing in God. Take great joy, the writer says, in the midst of your tribulations. Take great joy in it. We are in that same season. The prophets have promised that over these next couple of months, as we move into the election and at the time afterwards, as we move just towards January and the beginning of a new administration for our nation's leadership, prophets have promised it's going to be really a time of bitter warfare in the spirit and possibly in the natural as well. But he says, get in your booths and rejoice with me. Rejoice with me. Rejoice with me. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 27, and it speaks about the one thing that I desire, the one thing that I seek after, is to find myself in God's presence, in God's tabernacle, in God's temple, in the presence of God. So in the midst of warfare, in the midst of tribulation, in the midst of darkness, God says, tabernacle with me. Come into my presence and rejoice that I am your God, and we will see victory. Let me read one more passage, if I may. It's from John chapter 1, verse 14. I'm going to read it from the Message. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood. I love that. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. In the Passion Translation, and so the living expression became a man and lived among us. We gazed upon his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, overflowing with tender mercy and truth. Some translations actually say, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled in our midst. Why read those passages? The Lord is saying, I want you in this time of Sukkot to tabernacle with me. Rejoice in my great power and my great glory as I bring you through a turbulent and warring time to victory. And the reason? Because in the greatest moment of darkness, when a great shroud of death was over the world, the Lord says, I tabernacled with you. I came to dwell in your neighborhood and to be with you. So be with me. And as we rejoice together, and as we are anointed afresh for battle, know that the victory is ours. A blessed Sukkot. Dwell in his presence.